Now the other component, so we've already talked about visual organization in terms of figure and ground and form perception. The next part of our visual perception includes depth perception. And this too is learned, some people would even say is innate in understanding depth perception itself. It enables us to estimate an object's distance. So we estimate an object's distance from us, and ironically, even in a very commonplace sort of way, Hollywood uses our depth perception and our tendencies to judge things an object's distance away from us. They use it against us to make people look bigger than they are. Our depth perception apparatus manages to do a calculation, if you will, and for some species and organisms, from humans to kittens to monkeys, we have discovered through the use of what we call a visual cliff, monkeys, that this depth perception, which is what this is down here, the visual cliff, this depth perception appears almost to be innate. It's developed, if it is developed, it's developed at a very early age and during a time when there's no real exposure to it, and this visual cliff reveals the fact that depth perception is in part innate itself. So depth perception. Another one, which is all part of this larger visual perception piece, is we use two different kinds of cues to understand the world around us: binocular and monocular cues. Binocular cues is using information from both eyes, and the key component to this is what is called retinal disparity. And we judge based on the differences of the information coming from each eye. We judge the relative distance of an object by comparing these two, by the disparity between the retinal images within each eye itself. The image is cast very differently depending on where they are, so the greater the difference between them, greater the difference, the greater the distance. So the greater the difference, the greater the distance. One way that we do this, obviously, is when we're looking off into the distance, and we can actually use this against ourselves. If you do that little experiment of what is called the finger sausage, you will actually see where they converge, and how we manage information coming from our eyes. A couple other aspects that come with this, and there's many when we come to binocular things, or I should say monocular, and that's really the next one I want to get to here. I'm sorry. Is monocular, which means that we only really use information from one eye. And monocular cues there's many more of these, like for example, relative height, in other words, we look at and judge objects higher in our field as farther away, because we assume the lower part of the figure of ground is closer. So relative height. This is one of those that Hollywood uses against us to make people look giant-like. in the Harry Potter films, Hagrid was made to look like a giant, and most of the time it was because he was closer to the camera than Daniel Radcliffe and his friends who played Harry Potter and the main characters. So relative height, relative motion is another one which is important to understand in terms of how we judge motion and how fast we are actually going by the items in our field. Relative size, relative height are a little bit very much alike depending on how we actually see things. We assume two objects are similar in size, but most people perceive the one that casts the smaller image farther away. A couple other ones would include linear perspective, which oftentimes you see used in painting to create something off in the distance, which is kind of this sort of deal where an object is here and another object is here. One that's closer than farther away creates perceived distance. And then another one is interposition. And interposition, we make certain assumptions, and again, this is a good example of top-down processing. We make a assumption that if one object blocks our view of another, we perceive that object as closer. So we take the world in, and this is one of those places where context really strongly influences how we see, perceive the world around us. And then the last one is light and shadow. This is used a lot, actually, even in the internet. I remember with a fair amount of items on the internet are made to look wet or three-dimensional in a sense, and it depends entirely on light and shadow about how we actually look at things that way.